when we talk about markup and margin, um, we understand why we need margin, the benefits of helping us to make clear decisions, to really see exactly what we're going to make and how it applies to our profitability as a whole. What does it look like in, the ideal scenario for a contractor when they are bidding with margin? What does it look like each and every day when they go to price a job?
Hmm. Let me make one point before I attempt to answer that. Is you can use margin to find break even, the way we were talking about earlier, by
Right.
dividing your overhead by the margin. Okay. So if you have $100,000 and you divide it by 0.5, 50 cents or 50%, it tells you how much you have to sell to generate that margin. That if you take 100,000 and divide it by 50%, the answer is 200,000.
Right.
So that tells you your break even. You cannot do that with your markup, right?
Correct.
Because a 50% markup gives you a 33% margin,
Right.
right? $100, we're going to add 50 cents to it. 50 cents is a third of $1.50. So that's one reason you have to get the margin.
Mhm.
You can have a big enough markup that it's just as good as a margin, but you can't do the math with it. You have to get the margin. Uh, so now your question was, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis if you
Yeah,
bid
when you're
correctly?
pricing jobs, and you're looking through material costs and labor costs, and you've got this big project to bid, how does it look on an ideal scale to use margin rather than markup?
Well, the way I do it, and the way I encourage people to do it, begins with what I said earlier: know your costs
Mm.
and your real costs. Matter of fact, one way, don't remember who it was, somebody I highly respect, gosh, was saying that really good contractors are those who know their costs. That's their first attribute. They really know their costs. The really big guys, the really, really big guys working across states and 1,000 employees, you better damn believe they know their costs. And they kind of screw things up too. But it starts with know your costs. And then you don't have to, when you're adding margin to something, you alluded to it earlier. People mark up their labor, right, with a markup. And then they go over and they get their costs for their materials and they just throw it in, or they mark that up a little bit. Like maybe they double their labor and 10% on their concrete, on the
Yeah,
cement they're using. I don't care.
that's not what I'm
That's a
looking at.
mental that's a mental model that somebody uses, which is fine. That everybody has their way of thinking of things. I say aggregate your total costs, estimate your labor, how many hours, and how much does labor cost. And by the way, if you're paying $25 an hour plus $5 worth of benefits, your labor's $30. Okay, that's fair enough.
That's the other thing I was gonna
An
mention.
hour,
There's so
and
many things that aren't included inside of labor costs.
well, you are exactly right, but get those right. They're the real or write a check form labor cost. What you pay the guy, his benefits, you can even divide it by some number and kind of gross it up to cover his vacation pay. But
And
you get
maybe
an
his
hourly
workman's
cost.
comp. I know
Oh
that's an
yeah,
overhead
yeah,
expense, but just think about those things, right?
yeah. Well, if you can attach them to an hour, go ahead and do that and get a real labor cost. What I see a lot of times is people go, "Well, I got to add bird." I mean, I've got a story in my book of a manufacturing company that I asked them what their labor cost was, and they said $80 an hour. And I'm just going, in a small town in Western Oklahoma, Western Texas, go, no way, you know. Well, when we got to the real, how much they wrote, guys, it was like $25. It's been a while, including their workers' comp, including their vacation
Yeah.
pay. It's $25. I said, where'd you get this $80? They said, well, we got to have something to cover overhead. So they called $80 their cost, right? It's not. It Good bidding, in my mind, always begins with an accurate understanding of your cost. You can know the labor hours. You're going to have to get good at estimating. I mean, the labor cost per hour. You have to just get good at estimating how long it's going to take people.
Mhm.
I mean, that's part of the skill of becoming better and better. So you multiply those two together, then you get the real cost of the materials and the things you're going to use. And That's your real cost. And then you you gross that up by the margin to
Mhm.
get your bid price. That will give you a margin, right?
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think I like that you said the know your cost aspect. And maybe people think they know their costs, but they haven't gone into the detailed aspect of every little thing that goes into the cost for a job.
Well, we've got people listening, and I'm going to go ahead and confuse it a little bit, but they'll be thinking, oh, that skid steer, right? I bought that skid steer and I'm using it on that job, and I got to charge that job $100 an hour for that skid steer. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Why not 200? I don't know. Okay. I'll do two. No, how about 50? Right. Skid steer costs you what the skid steer costs. And generally, barring maintenance, you're going to have to pay for that skid steer whether you're using it or not.
Exactly.
Right. So so the overhead of owning a skid steer, I say, well, I want to charge them uh, $500 for using the skid steer for 2 days. I don't care. Go ahead, do that. That's just another way to raise your price,
Yeah.
right?
For you to justify it.
But you can get really, really complicated in trying to do things like allocate your billing clerk part of his or her time. Well,
Mhm.
they spend time, figuring out, calculating the monthly bills that we're invoicing. Oh, okay. But all of a sudden now you're just into this horrendous mess of, well, how much of the billing clerk's time went to this job and how much went to that job. And now you've got to hire two new accountants to keep track of all your assumptions. I'm just going, take the direct real costs, the labor times the cost per labor, the materials, any other things, fuel that gets you, tangible things that you actually write checks for, and call that your cost. The rest, I tend to leave it in overhead.
Yeah.
And I know there's some people listening that their heads are exploding because they'll yell at me all week about, got to allocate for profit. You got to allocate for burden, which is an allocation of a portion of overhead to the cob. I go, okay, but that's arbitrary. How
Mhm.
much you want to allocate? How, it's meaningless. Keep them separate. Make it
Yeah.
simple.
Well, I think,
So the real quick answer too on might be hard to follow on a podcast as opposed to sitting here with a pencil, but if you're going to use a markup, you take your cost and you multiply it times your markup. So a dollar, and you want a 50% markup, multiply, add that to it, $1.50. To
1.50.
find your margin, you take it, you take your cost as you calculated, $100,000 of cost, and you divide it by one minus your desired margin.
Yep.
That's where it gets hard. So
It's not that it's not that bad.
if you want a 40% margin, you have $100,000 job, you take one and subtract 40, which makes 60%, and you
Mhm.
take your 100,000 and divide it by 0.666, and you get $1.50.
There you
Okay,
go.
150,000. You now have your margin. That's just the way the math works out, which I think is one reason that some people don't use margins.
Well, it's just a formula, and adding it to
It's
it,
yeah,
but it's typically, I think that where it goes wrong is, like you said, knowing your costs. The
yeah.
the measurement of the cost is not accurate. So, um,
That's the number one thing.
yeah. Well, we've discussed markup and margin and a lot of ancillary things to it. But I think at the end of the day, it's okay to use a markup, but you have to know your margin. Um, the margin is the one that matters. It allows you to determine your break even, to know your profitability, um, and lots of different advice that we have throughout here. So, yeah, hopefully this is a valuable episode to people, just a conversation around it. Something else you want to say, Martin?
Yeah, I'm going to say that if you want to take something really easy away from here, just double everything. Okay. Know your accurate
Yeah,
costs, labor and materials, and then double it, and you'll have a 50% margin.
there you go.
And that probably will work for you.
Probably will work, but make sure you're doubling everything, not just some
Yeah.
of the things,
Yeah.
because that's where you run into issues. Is like, well, I doubled it, but you didn't account for
Yeah,
this,
that's one
this,
thing
and this, and
Tom
this, and
Reaver
this.
says. He said, just double everything. That's easy to understand. You don't have to follow Martin's babbling about markup and margin. Just double everything. But he also says when you get really good and really sophisticated, you can start bidding with nuance. In other words, I'm going to bid this one with a 35% margin because it's close to me and I've got accurate costs and we might be able to work some savings out. But I know I'm going to get 35. New guys double everything. So they get shoot for that 50%. They'll be lucky to get 25. That's just the way,
Yeah.
because of misbidding. That's just the way it works out. We've
Yeah.
all gone through that.